identifying yourself and give me a spelling of your name if we need to.
Okay, Dr. Daniel Cameron, D-A-N-I-E-L, and C-A-M-E-R-O-N.
And if I were to put a super on the screen, you would be?
I would be an internist and epidemiologist.
And how would that actually be written out?
Sometimes people write a comma, like, or and, they would do internist and cardiologist.
Right.
Internist and epidemiologist. But an epidemiologist is not a clinical specialty. It's like immunology, it's more of an academic type specialty.
But if you were to label yourself for a paper or a newspaper article, or
I would probably put internist and epidemiologist.
Okay. Let's start out with what is epidemiology?
Well, epidemiology is the study of diseases, but we study people rather than a test tube. We look at a problem, try to identify a problem, like we might look at the incidence of joint pain in the community, and we try to see if that is a problem, how often does it occur, when does it occur, is there anything to predict the joint pain, and we'd work out some sequence of events and try to get an idea of how the disease occurs.
If we're thinking of a younger audience who might be familiar with the word epidemic, how does the word epidemic refer to epidemiology?
Well, an epidemic would be if someone in the community would notice that there's a higher incidence of a problem, then they would go out in the community and count up the number of cases and look and see from a book as to whether there are more cases than you would expect. Then you would try to, with surveillance, you might go to an emergency room or a hospital or a doctor's office, try to count up the number of cases. If it's higher than you predict, you call it an epidemic.
Okay. How were you trained, or how is an epidemiologist trained?
Well, it's a degree that you get from going to graduate school. So often you go to 4 years of college, and then you go to graduate school and do 2 more years of training, and then you get a master's degree. I have a master's degree in public health. One could go and become a doctor of epidemiology. I went to medical school instead, so that I'm more of a clinical epidemiologist rather than a PhD of epidemiology. I'd be more likely to go out and conduct research in epidemiology. A PhD would more often train other epidemiologists or advise working groups as to how to approach an epidemic.
You're a medical doctor.
Yes.
When you were studying to be a doctor, what fact did you become? You went to medical school before you became an epidemiologist.
Right.
What made you? What's so fascinating about epidemiology?
Well, I went to the University of Minnesota, and much of the medical education was rote learning, where I would read a lot, take a test, go to a bedside with a doctor, learn what the doctor knew. And so I would learn all of these protocols, all these list of things to do. You got this knee pain, you do that test. But epidemiology brought me to how doctors think, how doctors organize information, and how doctors answer the questions. It brings me to the core of how problems are solved in medicine. And so, I love for the first time medicine, because it gave me the tools I needed to really look at problems and look at how medicine came about.
Would you say is an epidemiologist a detective of sorts?
Yes. If I was a mathematician, I would go into logic, and I would learn the tools of logic, and I would learn about theorems, like if A means B and B means C, then A leads to C. That old formula doesn't seem to be any different from what I might do as an epidemiologist. As an take a problem like if there are ticks in the community and they're biting people, and then people that get bit end up getting a rash in the same site, and then the rash is followed by arthritis, then it's the same type of organized logic. Now, many doctors use the logic, but an epidemiologist is trained as to how to lay it out in a diagram and how to use various mathematical tools to prove that point so that other doctors can be convinced that there is a problem.
So in a very general, very simple way, what are you trying to do as an epidemiologist?
Well, you try to solve problems looking at people and populations rather than a test tube.
I'm just thinking, I was going to come back to when you say problems, people don't know what kind of problems. I always assume when we're talking about medical things in programs that you have to really assume, even with well-educated people, a certain ignorance of the field.
Oh, well, there's two. The most common epidemic would be like an infection. Like you ask the question, why is this infection occurring? And you try to figure out what led to that infection. Well, we know so much now from epidemiology that we can do a test and quickly answer that question. But like there are always like new infections that don't seem to fit into our testing. And someone needs to come in from the Center for Disease Control or from that local health department and try to identify that problem. What is missing? Why can't the doctors in the community solve that infection or that arthritis? Why is there arthritis occurring in that area? So that it's very much of a problem solving. Issues identified, and you go out and try to come up with the answer.
Okay. And what is the method that an epidemiologist uses? How do you solve the problem?
Well, the first question that you have to work out is, what is the problem in the first place? Are you asking about the cause of an illness? Or are you asking about incidence of an illness? So that when you define the question, then you try to find out, is it more common in the area? Let me start over with that one.
Okay.
That the most common asked question of an epidemiologist is, what is the cause? So to try to determine cause in the community, you would want to know if what you think is the cause preceded the problem. So you want to know if that cause is present in those who have the disease and not in the other people in the community. Do you like examples?
Yeah.
Because an Epstein-Barr disease that a lot of people experience, that's the type of mono. They did show that a lot of people with Epstein-Barr also, with a positive Epstein-Barr test, also happened to have fatigue. So in the mid-1980s, they were able to show that if you had fatigue, it seemed to be from Epstein-Barr. People complained because they didn't do a good epidemiology study. They didn't go out to people without fatigue and do blood tests. So they found out that the entire population was exposed to Epstein-Barr. And so those with mono didn't end up with fatigue most of the time. So there was and so that we started this whole Epstein-Barr issue on a poor design. They didn't go out in the community and they didn't check those without fatigue. 90% of the population have fatigue. 90% of people with fatigue have Epstein-Barr. 90% 90% of those without fatigue have Epstein-Barr, so they weren't able to show any association, any kind of risk from the Epstein-Barr. I guess I'm not explaining it that well.
Well, let's talk about what we're interested in. How did you use, or how was epidemiology used to discover Lyme?
Well, there was a woman in Connecticut who was concerned. There were many children in her neighborhood that had joint pain and joint swelling, and they were being told that they had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Now that does occur. Juvenile means it's children, and it looks much like the adult rheumatoid arthritis. So by looking at one street and finding several cases, she thought that was too many to be explained by what you'd expect from juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So she kept asking questions. This seems to be an epidemic in my neighborhood. Then she went to the health department, and they weren't able to pursue it. Then she went to the Arthritis Foundation, was able to get some funding to study the juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. They went to Yale, and they got a physician named Dr. Steer. Dr. Steer, who was in his training, went out to Lyme, Connecticut, and looked at the number of cases of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So they identified a problem. It was much higher than they would expect. Then they asked the people who had Lyme, they asked the people who had this arthritis, how long you had it, was there anything in your history that's unique? There wasn't much. But because the incidence was higher than they expected, they asked other people in the community. Then they compared those with arthritis with those without arthritis. And they kept identifying a certain group of symptoms. Then they started writing papers in the 1970s about this set of symptoms, and they started referring to Lyme disease in the 1970s. That led to Dr. Brickdorfer in the Rocky Mountain lab to look at some ticks from that area, because that was one of the theories for what might have led to this disease, and he found the spirochete that caused Lyme. So there were really two epidemiology issues addressed. One was the pattern seen by Dr. Steer, and the other epidemiology question was there an organism that might have led to this disease? And that's where the CDC lab, funded in Montana, came through with the experience with tick-borne illnesses, and they were able to discover the organism. And so when they published this result in 1982, it led to a whole series of papers from that time on about this tick and about the organism in the tick. And so all that is once the discovery is made, they continue to work out the sequence of events. But the original observations were really started by somebody in the community asking the right kind of questions, which led to a whole sequence of events. But it was interesting that even in the 70s, they didn't know if Lyme was from a virus, from a bacteria, from just damage from a virus, from a tick. They had no idea. And there were some doctors proposed antibiotics, some doctors proposed steroids. But it was never clear how to manage Lyme until they discovered it was a bacteria. And then people started focusing their attention on the bacteria that cause Lyme.
So when you're working as an epidemiologist, there are really two steps in the process, right? One is you have to make sure that what you're talking about is actually the same disease, right? That it's,
Yeah.
in other words, a lot of people may have headaches, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an epidemic that's going to be caused by a single disease.
Yeah, that's where it comes back to the question. Somebody might observe something in the community, but to try to test that observation, it does require a careful look at the problem. Like, is it arthritis the persons are talking about? So that they'll go through a careful evaluation to try to identify the problem. Can you learn from other parts of the country? Can you learn from other doctors? But you try to identify the problem. In this case, the problem was unexplained joint pain in an area of Connecticut. And they went in and identified, yes, it was joint pain. And so it's natural to go to a rheumatology department. So they went to a rheumatology department at Yale, and so they identified it as a rheumatology problem. But the rheumatologist really said, well, is this a rheumatology problem or is it a new disease? So they did keep their ideas open and continued to pursue it as a new problem. And they were able to stimulate enough interest in this joint pain to eventually lead to a new organism. And it surprised a lot of people that careful attention to that joint pain led to broader issues of the possibility of an infection.
Could we, assuming again a younger audience, can we maybe say something about, I don't know how I want to do this, but the scientific method and how the basis of all of this seems to me is that one has to be a careful observer and that close observation, keeping track of observation is the basis of the method. Is that true?
Yeah,
You can't just go out there and sort of guess around, right? You have to keep good records.
Right. At first, it's good to talk about it. Then the study group gets together and tries to identify the problem. So we sit down.
Come on in for a sec. Let's start over again. Let's start that over. Do you need a question or you can just go right ahead?
Well, you better ask the question.
Are we okay? So it seems that observation and good record keeping is a key part of what you do.
Yeah, I think that all physicians and everyone asks the question, but they bring it to an epidemiologist to narrow in on what the question is. And then they'd ask the epidemiologist, well, how can I go about testing my theory? How can I prove it to myself? And then how can I go out to other doctors and other people in the community and say, this is the answer? So it requires a very organized approach to solve the problem and then show everyone that you worked it out correctly. You've worked out the answers. And that means that if you already have this theory that A leads to C, you have to show that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, that you worked out every question. And that means you're part of a working group, that a rheumatologist would work with an epidemiologist to really answer the question carefully, every step of the way, so that all critics can be heard and we're comfortable with the problem and we're comfortable with what led to the problem. And I should mention that we do all these things so that we can identify causes of disease and maybe can help treat the disease better or educate the public about what to do with these diseases. Like in Lyme, it was by discovering discovering that it was a tick that led to Lyme, we were able to advise the public that they should do careful tick checks, that they should be careful when they go out in the community in areas where there are a lot of ticks, and wear protective clothing, look at the style of what they wear, and the kind of amount of time they spend with pets. And all of these are meant to help the public with that particular disease. It's many epidemiologists end up working at the Center for Disease Control because the government feels it's important to study disease patterns, and how to solve those important public health problems. And so if somebody calls from Connecticut and says, I see this joint pain, then they're equipped with an epidemiologist to go in and answer that question and advise the public as to what the cause is of that particular disease and what they can do about it. You can see that every night in the news anyway, is that a problem is identified, and they're often at the Center for Disease Control to ask, well, what caused it? How frequent is it? How big a problem is it? What can we do? Though right away, in one day, many of the questions are asked, and the job of the Center for Disease Control and public and health departments is to have an organized way to answer those questions.
That's really another way of saying, what does the epidemiologist do?
Yeah.
Can we just go back to our beginning question, and maybe in a very condensed, generalized television time frame form? Let me ask you a question. What does an epidemiologist do? And just try answering it in the most direct, compressed way.
An epidemiologist sees a public health problem and quickly has all of the tools, all of the mathematics, all of the questions ready so they can solve the problem in a few days. If it requires getting a specialist like a rheumatologist involved, they'll put the team together, go out and answer that public health problem.
But figuring all this stuff out often actually takes more than a couple of days, takes years, and there are a lot of dead ends and frustrations along the way.
But it only takes a couple of days if it's a food outbreak after a wedding, because there's immediate questions asked about, was it the ice, was it the food, was it the virus? But questions like Lyme can take years to identify what is the problem, what can one do about the problem, and then it takes even more years to work out all the details and educate the public and educate the physicians. And you have to educate them in a nice logical sequence so they know everything from the organism that causes Lyme, which is a bacteria, to how it gets into the body, what the bacteria does in the body, what are the disease manifestations, like why are we getting joint pain, why are we getting joint swelling, why are we getting headaches, and what happens over time.
Okay. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
No.
Good. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.